How you doing?
I'm okay this session.
You have to have the mic pretty close to you. We actually stopped the frustration.
As the budget chair, I got a meeting. You must have which was there.
Okay, I think it's
At least we get. I'm like this poor guy who's got to come 4,000 miles. Never seen you.
Well, good morning. I want to welcome everybody to the launch of the Salish Sea Marine Survival Project, which is an international research coalition put together by Long Live the Kings and the Pacific Salmon Foundation, but including a number of partners who are listed on the screen to my right. So we have a fairly packed agenda for this morning. The purpose of this is to announce this new research initiative, also to talk about funding that we have received and some of the funding needs that we have going forward. One of the reason why we're here and why we're doing this project is that salmon spend at least 50% of their life cycle in the marine environment. And we have a fairly clear idea of what salmon need and what they do in the freshwater systems, and we are putting a lot of effort into recovering salmon and managing salmon stocks in their freshwater environment. We know considerably less about the marine systems, but as Kurt Fresh, who's a friend of mine and a scientist with NOAA, says, the early phase when salmon and steelhead enter the marine environment is like puberty times 100. It's a very important time in their physiological cycle when they move through a series of changes and have to establish living in salt water and eating a different diet. And so this is a really critical time. It turns out that marine survival in the Salish Sea, the shared waters between British Columbia and Washington, has decreased significantly from the 1970s through the 1990s and 2000s. It was also relatively low on the coast because of climate conditions, but this problem has not rebounded in concert with improving ocean conditions in the Pacific Ocean. So it is of significant concern, both from a salmon and steelhead recovery perspective and also from a fisheries management perspective. We are having a difficult time identifying why salmon and steelhead stocks are highly variable on return, and it makes it difficult to manage the fisheries. So today, I want to explain what's going on at the event. We're going to have a series of speakers who are going to come up to the podium and give their brief impressions of why this is important, what it means to them, and what they're doing in terms of trying to provide support for this effort or what they're doing materially. Then we're going to have a series of panelists who are experts working on the project, or their staff are deeply involved in this work. They'll speak briefly, and then we're going to open this up to questions from the press and the audience. I would ask you to withhold applause for each one of the speakers until the end. There'll be a chance to thank us. We're going to end as promptly close to 9:30 as possible, because there will be the public will be entering the aquarium at 9:30, and at 10 they will be feeding the fish, and we don't want to compete with that. I also want to thank Bob Davidson and Mark Plunkett from the Seattle Aquarium for allowing us to use this space. It's a great venue for this kind of activity, and we really, really appreciate that. The speakers that we have today are Brian Riddle, who's my colleague from the Pacific Salmon Foundation in British Columbia, Bill Ruckelshaus, who's a Long Live the Kings board member and longtime supporter of Puget Sound and salmon recovery in the region, Representative Ross Hunter from the state of Washington legislature, Congressman Adam Smith from the 9th Congressional District, Phil Anderson, who's the director of the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, Will Stell, who's the regional director for National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, Terry Williams, who from the Tulalip tribe, who's also in the Treaty Rights Office there, and Jeanette Dorner with the Puget Sound Partnership, who runs the ecosystem and salmon recovery team there. So, with that, I'd like to ask Brian Riddle to come up very briefly and talk about how the Pacific Salmon Foundation got involved in this type of work.
Brian. Thanks, Jacques. And thank all of you for coming this morning. It is fair to say today has been a long time coming. And many of you probably don't realize just how long. So I thought I'd sort of set the tone here this morning by saying that we're not talking about something that just happened. We're talking about something that has been largely ignored for 25 years. And the scale of that time is long, but the effect is huge in fish. In the Strait of Georgia, where I'm from, you're talking about 1 million coho a year lost to the recreational angler alone, not counting commercial, 500,000 Chinook salmon, and today, we actually have, in the Strait of Georgia, the whole area, 0 retention of wild coho and a catch of Chinook that is 1/10 of what it was before. Now, those are big numbers, but put that into effect on local communities. You basically lose all that income for recreational fishing and tourism throughout the Strait of Georgia. And then you can talk about the effect on the social and cultural programs around the Strait for commercial fishermen, recreational fishermen, and First Nations. Now, why is the PSF involved? The Pacific Salmon Foundation is a Canadian charitable organization dedicated to salmon conservation and restoration. And we became involved because nobody else was. What it came down to, when I left the government in 2009, the very first thing anybody said to me is, why don't you take on restoring Chinook and coho salmon in the Strait of Georgia? And there really isn't any better challenge for the Pacific Salmon Foundation than that. So we are very, very happy to be here today. Our work in this started in 2009. We published the first comprehensive report on the plan in November 2009. So we've got a few more years invested in this, and so we are very, very happy to be here today, and we are very happy to be working with Jacques and with Michael and Long Live the King so that we can actually tackle this challenging problem, and it will have benefits, no question about that. So thank you very much for being here.
Thanks, Brian. So Long Live the Kings got involved in this project, and for those of you who don't know, we're a nonprofit organization based in Seattle that is dedicated to recovering wild salmon and steelhead and supporting sustainable fishing. And this project is one of several of our important efforts where we are trying to bring science to bear on natural resource issues in the region. We got involved in this because in 2010, Michael Schmidt, who works for us, hosted a workshop in the State of the Salmon Conference in Portland, which was supposed to be focused on the interaction between hatchery and wild fish in the marine environment of the Salish Sea. There were scientists and managers from Canada and the US attending that meeting, and what the consensus was from that session was that hatchery interactions were not as critical an issue right now as was survival of both wild and hatchery fish. And Michael came out of that session and said to me, I think this is an important issue and I think we should try to do something about it. And so we started to pursue this and put together a technical team and a coordinating committee to help us to identify what were the technical needs of a research project, to identify what were the causes of low survival in the Puget Sound and the Strait of Georgia and Strait of Juan de Fuca, and also to identify sources of funding and how to marshal existing resources and identify new resources to do that work. What came out of that was a meeting early on with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation in Portland. Christina Wolniakowski got Brian and Michael and I together to talk about this, and we decided that it would be a good idea to have a workshop. So in this fall, we had 90 scientists from both sides of the border get together and discuss the different aspects of salmon and steelhead survival in the Salish Sea. From that workshop, we produced a report. Results and recommendations that came out of that is the foundation of the research plan that we're now executing. After the workshop, we've been busy working on a research plan with the technical team from both sides of the border in order for us to catch up with the folks in British Columbia who had published one in 2009. And what has resulted are two things that we're going to talk a little bit about today. One is a research plan for steelhead survival in the Salish Sea that will be supported by a new appropriation for the Puget Sound Partnership and the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife of $788,000 from the legislature this year. And in this current climate, that is a really huge victory, we think. So, Brian mentioned that fisheries had been reduced to 1/10 of what they were in British Columbia. One of the outcomes of the workshop, and there are graphs here that sort of explain this, for coho, steelhead, and Chinook salmon in the Puget Sound and the Georgia Basin, marine survival is about 1/10 of what it was at its peak in the 1970s. So this is a serious issue. It has persisted through and probably in part resulted in the listing. And as we address freshwater habitat and restoring freshwater environments for salmon, we also need to pay attention to the marine environment. With that, I would like to ask Congressman Smith to come up and speak briefly on his perspective.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the work that you all are doing on salmon recovery and, broadly, more importantly, protecting the Puget Sound and our water quality. The indications that you've heard about, the declining salmon runs in different places are deeply troubling, but they're also indications of a larger problem, and that's the health of the Puget Sound and the entire Salish Sea. I want to take a moment just to thank former Congressman Norm Dix. He did a ton of work on making sure that we got money to sort of figure out what was going on with Puget Sound, and it's a large, complicated problem as the water flows in from a lot of different places. I was actually down in Pierce County yesterday with Commissioner Peter Goldmark looking at a restoration project for one of the creeks that flows into Puget Sound. As you know, there are literally thousands of those. So making sure that we control pollutants and control the runoff there is a huge part of it. And then working with our Canadian partners to understand what happens along the lines of what you just described, also a critical part of it. I want to thank the state legislature for funding this specific study. And I want to apologize on behalf of the federal government for sequestration. And all of the cuts and all of the chaos, I guess is the best way to describe it, in terms of trying to figure out what the federal government is going to spend money on. I could go off on a lengthy explanation of that. Personally, I wish we'd turn sequestration off tomorrow, and just be done with it. It's not helping anything. It's devastating our economy and not doing much for the deficit. But don't have the votes for that, so the federal government is where it is. We will try to continue to be helpful to find funds for these types of environmental protections. Making sure that we have clean water is not just about fish. I always got into this argument about the Endangered Species Act, and people would say, well, what difference does it make, about the one species of this, that, or the other thing? But the whole point of it is it's an indicator species. It's going to the health of the planet for all life, including us. And if we develop, waterways that cannot sustain the lives of salmon or other fish, then that is a danger to our entire planet. So that's the steps we're supposed to take. That's why these sorts of studies are so important. They give us a little insight on what the challenges are and hopefully guide us on how we can begin to meet them. So to the extent the federal government can help, I know I and Congressman McDermott and our entire delegation will try and help as best we can. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I look forward to hearing more of the comments about how we can best help confront this very, very significant problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Congressman. Now I'd like to introduce Representative Ross Hunter from the 48th Legislative District. Also, thank you very much for your support this session.
Well, good morning, everybody. I have the joy, sometimes it's the joy of running the budget in the House of Representatives. And I look at Adam here and I think, wow, we actually get to pass legislation. And so that's a useful thing. Sometimes it takes us a little bit longer than you might expect. With him here, I can't make all the normal jokes that I'd make about Congress. And so I'll pass on that, but I was struck with the remark about as these fish enter the saltwater, it's like puberty for them. And I have 2 children who are just entering the phase of life where they leave the house and you have no idea what they eat. How do they not get beriberi? So maybe there are other studies that we can fund that would, research that, but they seem to make it through to adulthood. So unlike the fish, so perhaps this is the right place to put the money. We approach the budget from the state trying to be intentional about what it is that we're trying to get done. And when you look at the entire economic health of our region, it's not driven by how many fish can you pull out and have available for purchase at QFC, though that's an attractive feature for all of us who live here. The economic health of the region is driven by, do people want to live here? Can we attract young people with technical degrees? Can we grow the economy here? And that totally depends on having an environment in which we all want to live. It's good for our economics. It's good for us to live here. I grew up on the East Coast, spent a bunch of time in Cleveland. And I don't think I was actually at my aunt's house when the river caught on fire there. But it has made that part of the country sort of like, do you really want to live there? We will not succeed as a region if we have that kind of problem. Now, no one thinks that the sound is actually going to catch on fire, but this is an indicator. We need to be smart about how we do it. We need to do research. We need to have an environment that really works to have our entire economy work. You guys are doing the research. You're making it work. We're trying to rebuild the sound and get it back, and let's do it smart, and we're happy to keep funding it, though you're going to have to pressure us to do that. So with that, I'm here. I'm also happy to learn about how you're doing this today, but doing it is really important. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. Now, Brian and I are going to talk a little bit about money. Now that we've heard from our appropriators in the audience. What we're really focused on here is to not let what has been a scientific black box turn into a black hole for our fish and steelhead and salmon. So we are really focused on trying to understand what's going on so we can both take the necessary measures to recover salmon and steelhead populations and also to manage our fisheries effectively and understand what our returns are going to look like. To develop this project, we have received funding to date, generous funding from the Puget Sound Partnership, from the Salmon Recovery Funding Board, from the Tulalip Tribe, from Washington Sea Grant, and from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. That has what has supported the development of the hosting of the workshop, the coordination of the technical team, the development of these reports, and the writing of proposals to date. The appropriation for $788,000 that the Puget Sound Partnership put together, Jeanette Dorner worked on this with her director and the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, and that was put into the governor's budget and is now part of the Puget Sound Partnership budget for the next biennium, is a very critical first investment. To put that in perspective, we anticipate that this program is going to cost over the next 5 years roughly $10 million on both sides of the border, and that's about $2 million a year. Now, not all of that will be new money. Some of that will be leveraging existing resources in academia, in state and federal agencies, in tribes, and in nonprofits like Long Live the Kings and Pacific Salmon Foundation. But it will be a significant new investment. I will also say that yesterday I was at a congressional hearing in Tacoma where John Stein, from who's the director of the Northwest Fisheries Science Center in Montlake, mentioned that they no longer, who's here today, John, they no longer have a fisheries-capable research vessel stationed in Puget Sound. I mentioned this to Brian at dinner last night, and he mentioned to me that the fisheries research vessel, the Ricker in Canada, is on its last legs and probably shouldn't go to sea. So we have a fundamentally important hurdle to get over, which is to get access to the water so we can do this research. And this will require an initial upfront investment, and it's a critical need for our region. We have some proposals pending to get more support for this. There is a proposal pending with Washington Sea Grant. There is for work on Chinook. There is also a proposal pending with the Salmon Recovery Funding Board for work in North Puget Sound. And we have just received an allocation for funding on work on both sides of the border out of cycle from the Pacific Salmon Commission, Southern Endowment Fund. So we are working on this and on this side of the border, but we will need to find probably something like another $1 million to support this work fully in 2014. Now, and of that money, probably about 5 to 7% will be used by our organization to continue coordinating this effort, continue to seek funding, and to build this bridge across the border.
Thanks, Jacques. Well, the other point that I think we have to emphasize here is that a comprehensive program in international waters requires the two sides of the coin. So I want to just take a second and say that your money would be well directed, that we do have a plan on the Canadian side. I mentioned that we had a proposal in 2009. Jacques dropped the heavy point of $10 million. And everyone in this room knows that it's not easy to find $10 million these days, and so it is a challenge, as we heard from our government reps this morning. But in Canada, we have a rather unique opportunity. So probably half of the money will come from the recreational fishermen alone. So when a fisher in Canada wants to fish in the tidal waters of Canada, you have to buy a license. And on that license, to keep a salmon, you buy a salmon conservation stamp. Well, in the past 2 years, we have been working with government to ensure that that money all comes back to British Columbia. We used to get $1 out of 6 for the stamp. We, in the last federal budget, were successful. Every dollar that is contributed now will return to British Columbia through the Pacific Salmon Foundation, and it now allows us to open future opportunities by increasing the value of the stamp. Not by a lot of money. It's a fabulous model of a large number of participants and a little bit of money. So for every $4 increase, that's $1 million that we put directly into the Strait of Georgia. Right? So over 5 years, $5 million out of 10. We then go to corporate partners and private individuals. Last year, we received our largest corporate donation ever for the Strait, $1 million from Goldcorp, a mining company in Vancouver. And at the same time, we have been talking with the federal and provincial governments. You cannot do this project without the federal government involved in Canada because they have the scientists, the labs, and the research vessels. So they are directly involved without actually adding cash because we get the in-kind from the scientists and that. And then the other side is we will be going through other foundations to raise the balance. So we are telling people now that while we don't have the money in pocket, we have a very realistic model to raise these funds, and it will be half paid for by private funding. All right, so that actually is carrying some weight. So we feel very confident that we can now kick this off, and we will carry our half of the funding requirement in this project.
Thank you, Brian. Okay, so that ends the stand-up speakers, and now we're going to go to our panel of experts. I would like to invite Phil Anderson to say a few words. You can just stay seated and speak to the microphone there. But please, everybody, do put your mouth close to the microphone so that we can get this all on videotape and audio.
Thanks very much, Jacques, for giving me this opportunity to be here this morning. I wanted to acknowledge Long Live the Kings as an organization and the Pacific Salmon Foundation. I've been affiliated and have worked with the Long Live the Kings for a number of years, and talk about a progressive organization to take this kind of a project on. You know, I've been quoted as saying that, in my view, this is the most important work that we could do right now. And let me, in my 3 minutes that I have, tell you why I think this is the most important project for us to do. You know, we collectively, contributions from federal government, state government, local jurisdictions have spent millions and millions of dollars on habitat restoration and protection in terms of trying to rebuild our salmon and steelhead stocks. And despite these investments in this work, you can see from the charts that our salmon and steelhead stocks have continued to decline. We have made drastic reductions in harvest in both state and tribal fisheries over the past 2 decades. And despite those reductions in harvest, our wild populations of salmon and steelhead in Puget Sound have continued to decline. Hatcheries. We've made huge investments in our hatcheries in terms of hatchery reform, ensuring that our hatchery production does not impede recovery of wild populations of Chinook and steelhead in particular. And despite those efforts, the abundance of our wild salmon, Chinook, coho, steelhead have continued to decline. Steelhead are our state species, and they of all are in the biggest trouble. And when we look at what has happened in terms of what we call their adult survival, the proportion of fish that enter the marine environment and live long enough and become adults to return to their native streams, it has crashed. We have steelhead that enter the Sound out in Nisqually that we know can make it to the entrance of the Strait of Juan de Fuca in just 6 to 8 days. But what we've also learned is there is an extremely high proportion of those fish that die in those 6 to 8 days. The Department of Fish and Wildlife, resulting from funding that's provided from our citizens, federal government, is releasing 25 to 30 million Chinook salmon a year out of our hatcheries. The majority, the huge majority of those are dying. So of all these investments that we are making in areas that we need to invest in order to get a return on that investment, we have to solve this problem. We have to figure out what the cause is of the high mortality rates of our juvenile salmon that are entering Puget Sound and the balance of the Salish Sea, or our investments in the rest of these areas will not bring the kind of results that we were looking for. That is why I think this is the most important work that we have in terms of steelhead recovery, Chinook salmon recovery, coho recovery within the Salish Sea, is to solve this problem. And why I continue to say this is the most important work that we can possibly focus on in the next 5 years in order to maximize our benefits from those other investments and recover wild salmon and steelhead populations in Puget Sound. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Phil. Will, would you like to say something?
Yes, thank you, Jacques. Let me first of all echo Phil's praise for both the Kings and the Pacific Salmon Foundation, and congratulate you both on today and on the launching of the project. Let me also say Phil got it exactly right on why does this matter. And the first point I was going to, the first question I was going to ask is, why does this matter? Phil just told you why. Another question which occurs to me is, well, why bother? You can't do anything about it anyhow. Well, let me offer a couple of reasons as to why we should bother. The first is it will change, or it may very well change, how we do our business as fishery managers and as hatchery managers. Why? Because if we can better understand with better precision what is affecting survivals of Chinook, steelhead, and coho, and different survival rates in different locations for different populations, that in turn will have a direct effect on how we manage our harvests on those stocks and how we manage our hatchery production and release strategies for those stocks as well. So to the question of, is there anything you can do about it? The answer is heck yes. The second is it will absolutely affect how we predict what's going on and what to expect. Because if we can better develop indicators of marine survivals, near shore and deep marine survivals, then we can better estimate what's going to be coming back where and calibrate our managerial responses accordingly. So predict the uncertainties will drop and the accuracy of our predictions will increase significantly. And the third point as to why bother is because it goes to the larger, it contributes to the larger issue of accountability. Again, as Phil said, we are putting huge efforts into a variety of restoration programs on habitat, freshwater habitat, estuarine habitat, on hatchery reforms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If we're not seeing adult returns pop up as a result of those investments, folks who don't like it are going to say, it's a waste of money, it doesn't work, stop. Wrong. If we can understand what's happening in nearshore survivals and better predict what's happening in nearshore survivals, we can paint a more accurate and more complete picture about what's going on with these populations, and in so doing, be more accountable for the investment strategies across the life cycle and across the multiple habitats in order to contribute to success over time. So does it matter? Absolutely. Why bother? Because it's a system, it will contribute to success over time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Will. Terry, please give us your input.
Okay, thank you. First, I'd like to say we're really pleased to be a part of this process as well. And I think those of us who have come together to look at this particular problem, there is more than one problem, but this is one that is critical, that we've been able to share our expertise and try to focus on what types of issues that are affecting the survival rates of plankton and forage fish, part of the food chain, we can address, and how do we address that? In fact, you know, in looking at it, the plankton and forage fish are kind of the bottom of the food chain. There's a whole range of foods that will be affected by this impact. And I think that's what we're trying to understand is what's in this, what we call the black box, the ocean sometimes. Within this box, you know, what's going wrong and how can we identify a solution to help get us back on the right track again with our productivity. And I think, you know, salmon, steelhead, coho, other species are good indicators of that. One thing I wanted to tell you, though, is that those species are also critically important for our tribal culture. In fact, the treaties that we signed guaranteed that we would always have these species available to us and we could survive in our culture. But that's not happening. That's one of the reasons we wanted to be a part of this group, was to help be a part of trying to understand where the problems are. And I think with that, you know, things like habitat management or fisheries management, or even looking at marine conditions through a scientific perspective, learning how to pull all of those together in a way that gives us a comprehensive direction, I think is what we're wrestling with. How do we make these different pieces come together in a way that produces a better quality of marine water, a better quality of fresh water? But I think along with that, the one thing that we see is missing, even with all of the programs that we have going in restoration for Puget Sound and the watersheds, is the funding for monitoring and research. And it's extremely hard to get those pieces pulled together in a way that's comprehensive. And I think that's what we're talking about today, is as we start looking at the plan that's being developed, to find a way to look at the funding sources that can be available, whether they're governmental or private or from whatever direction they come from, to be crafted in a way that gets us to finding a way to solve this problem. And certainly, I think from a tribal perspective, as we look at the guarantees of the U.S. to our treaties, we have to think that if we're not a part of developing how we maintain that guarantee, we're not being responsible or accountable ourselves. So I think it's very important for our tribes to come together and to help us through our programs, along with everybody else, to align ourselves to make this successful. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Terry. So Jeanette from Puget Sound Partnership is our last panel speaker.
Good morning. So I'm the last in the long line of speakers today, so I'm going to be brief. Most people know that the Puget Sound Partnership is the state agency that's charged with leading the recovery of Puget Sound. But not as many people know that we are one of the 8 regional organizations in the state of Washington charged with leading the collaborative effort to recover salmon. And it makes sense for us to work both on Puget Sound recovery and on salmon recovery. Puget Sound needs salmon to be healthy. Salmon need a healthy Puget Sound. So we need to be successful in both to achieve both of those charges that we've been given, to work with all of the partners in Puget Sound to do that. So one of the roles that we play in our charge to lead the effort for Puget Sound salmon recovery is we convene a group called the Puget Sound Salmon Recovery Council that has representatives of all the Puget Sound watersheds, tribes, government agencies, environmental nonprofits, the business and the ag community. And that is the policy body that we bring together to discuss what are the most important things we can do to work together in Puget Sound on salmon recovery. And that group last year agreed that what we're gathered here today to talk about, the Marine Survival Project, is one of the most important things that we can do together to achieve salmon recovery in Puget Sound, to understand better why our fish are dying and what we can do about it, so that we can inform future actions that will be successful in recovering the fish. And so that's why the agency submitted the request to the governor last fall for the funding, the $788,000, and we're very grateful that the governor and the state legislature agreed to include that in our budget. And we really appreciate the leadership of Long Live the Kings and the Pacific Salmon Foundation in leading this effort, and the team of scientists that they've been working with, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, NOAA Fisheries Science Center, the tribal scientists that have put together this work plan that will help guide our next steps. So we really appreciate everybody coming together today and think that this is a very important project.
Thank you, Jeanette. So I'm going to explain where we're going to go from here today in the proceedings. And also I want to acknowledge that Congressman Jim McDermott was hoping to join us, but he was unable to attend, and he is represented by Pete Mills today. I also want to acknowledge that the chair of the Leadership Council for the Puget Sound Partnership, Martha Consgard, is here. I think we're remiss on our screen. Washington Department of Ecology has also been a participant, and Josh Baldy is here from the department. Is there anybody else who I should be recognizing that I'm missing? If you see somebody important next to you, raise your hand so I don't force somebody to recognize themselves. Anyway, so now we're going to open this up to questions to any members of the press or the audience for any of our panel members or formal speakers. And then Bill Ruckelshaus is going to give some closing remarks, and then I'm going to thank a few folks, and we're going to excuse you to go about your day. So there is a microphone, so please, so that your remarks are recorded, speak into the microphone. Any questions? In the back. Oh, sorry, we'll get you next. And please say who you are and who your question's addressed to, if anyone in particular.
This is Gabriel Spitzer from KPLU, and I'm loud. This would be to, I suppose, any of you who could just outline some of the methodologies that are going to be involved in the study. What is the actual research going to consist of?
Well, I will take a stab at this, and we have a number of folks who are involved in the technical team present today, so please feel free to stand up and add value to anything that I say. I am involved in promotion of the project and not in the details of the research. So as I understand it, the focus of this research is going to be on the juvenile fish themselves as they exit the river. So we'll be evaluating their health upon leaving freshwater environment to understand whether or not they are in good condition as they enter the marine environment, and is there something left over from their freshwater residency that is causing poor survival in the marine environment. There will be, we will evaluate their spatial distribution and condition in the early residency of the marine environment throughout the Salish Sea. So we will be looking both in southern British Columbia and in Washington State and evaluating the fish. There are already significant efforts to measure water quality and the physical parameters of the marine environment related to the PSEMP program, or ongoing monitoring programs that are managed by organizations like the Department of Ecology. So we do not need a big increase in effort there. We do need a big increase in effort in tracking these juvenile fish, tracking their condition, and also a big gap is their food resources. We do not have good data on zooplankton, which are the small animals that drift around, and these are either fish larvae or crustaceans or other invertebrates that drift around in the marine environment and provide food resources at this critical time. So there will be an increased effort to track fish, an increased effort to track their food, and an increased effort to look at how that relates to physical parameters in the environment, including things like toxics and toxins from algal blooms. In addition to that, there's going to be a significant retrospective evaluation of existing data to see what we can mine from that to tell us more about the condition of the fish and what might, some of these trends be related to in the environment that we have existing information on. Now, if there's anyone else who would like to, Brian.
I think just to really pull together what Jacques is saying, the new element of this is the comprehensive nature of everybody studying every level of the ecosystem at the same time. And when you really do the retrospective assessment, what you find is there's lots of good quality research going on. There are many people involved, but the work is frequently very fragmented. So you have a particular result that's appropriate in a particular estuary or a particular time of year. You don't have 5 years of continuous research looking at weather, ocean climate, ocean conditions, following the plankton spring bloom to the zooplankton, to the forage fish, to the salmon, and then to the killer whales. I mean, ultimately, where there is no comprehensive study in the United States or in in Canada or in the Puget Sound that is actually bringing all of our expertise together in a unified research program that will be able to actually explain an observation when you see it and you can track it back mechanistically is what we would think of, right? And it's only by understanding mechanisms and looking to measure key environmental variables on an annual basis that you're really going to improve forecasting if we can. So really the newness is that there is the leadership and the will now to pull all these units together. So in Canada, we have every university in the Strait of Georgia, every government lab, and all of the foundations involved, and a number of individual communities, many people involved in community science. All of this is going to be unified into one comprehensive, intensive program for 5 years. That's what I would emphasize as the newness.
So on that line, I want to say that we invited Lisa Grimlich, who's the chair of the director of the College of the Environment, or the chair of the College of the Environment, but she wasn't able to attend. But we do have Jan Newton from the University of Washington, who's the co-chair of the ocean acidification program at the University of Washington. She's also a member of the technical team. Another question. In the back?
Hi, Ashley Ahern with KUOW. There's been more and more research about the impacts of salmon farming in Canada. I wonder if you could speak to how you will be looking at that in your research as a potential contributor to the declines in salmon stocks, as we start considering some salmon farms down here, more salmon farms down here.
Off the record. The salmon farms are one of the 14 major projects that we're undertaking. The projects that we're looking at now involve a lot of the media you've heard recently about pathogens being introduced into BC if they're new, and the effects on Pacific salmon. That project is currently just underway. It's being run by myself and Dr. Christy Miller-Saunders at the Biological Station, and we're working with Genome Canada, applying the newest technologies and looking, really developing from the Human Genome Program and looking at new technologies and how we can do surveys of pathogens in salmon and in ocean waters. And to really associate the farm to disease is a lot of steps in between. And so it is a multi-year program. We have 4 stages in the research, and it's really in second stage now of developing the assays, the methodology, and doing the critical evaluation or validation, so that when we say that a pathogen is present, we have a very, very high degree of confidence that it is. So that work is underway. Other work on whether there are habitat effects, that will involve monitoring programs through our habitat branch and that. So, but they are directly involved as one of the major projects.
Other questions?
I'll take your nice slow pitch there, Jacques, and just say greetings to everybody on behalf of Dean Lisa Gromlich from the University of Washington College of the Environment. And I can say there are a lot of scientists from the University of Washington, both in the School of Aquatic and Fisheries Sciences and the School of Oceanography, involved in this study. It's a great honor to be at this gathering and see all these folks come together. And Jacques mentioned the new Washington Center for Ocean Acidification that Dr. Terry Klinger and myself will be directing, and I just want to assure you that the research that comes from that will be very much integrated with the research going on here, because to understand ocean acidification, you need to understand the food web and many of the same physical and chemical factors as marine survival for salmon. So a lot of times we hear about stovepipe research, and I just want to assure you that these will be very well integrated. Thank you.
Thanks, Jan. Terry.
Maybe just to follow up on that remark, I think one of the things that's important about this process is the monitoring and research that's ongoing. That ongoing process is going to be risen to another level now, much more complex, and the detail that needs to be understood to find out what's affecting these species is going to be on a level that we've not really had a lot of experience in, but I think the reality is it's going to bring us a tremendous amount of information on how to do problem solving. So I really appreciate the fact that you have put that lab together at the university, and we can start exploring these new techniques and find out what it tells us.
Okay, up front.
Good morning. Lori Montoya from the Seattle Aquarium. I'm wondering if this effort will focus on educating the scientific community and educational community and political community, or will there be any public education effort?
Well, thanks for asking that question. This is in part an effort to increase public awareness around this project. I think that a partnership with the aquarium, I was actually just thinking about what I wanted to say about that at the end of this, because we are beginning to form an informal partnership with the aquarium to host events like this, or fundraising events and information events, and I think that maybe a more formal relationship with your organization makes sense. And if you wanted to incorporate some of the themes on the research that comes out of this into your exhibits and your programs, that would be really terrific. I mean, that's just one element. We haven't thought, we're so focused on trying to get researchers in the field doing this work that we have not worked as hard on the education and outreach elements of it, other than to funders and supporters. Other questions? Okay, well, so I had hoped that Bill Ruckelshaus would open this session and that Norm Dix would close it, but Norm actually is working on an international issue right now. He was called away to negotiate the U.S.-Canada-Columbia River Treaty in Portland this morning, and so he was unable to be here in his new capacity as a private citizen. So we wish him luck, and we hope that turns out to be as a cooperative venture as this is. So with that, I would like to invite Bill. You can come up and give your remarks if you want, and then I will close us out and send you on your way.
Jacques, thanks very much. Jacques asked me to say a few words at the end of this session. Actually, he sent me some talking points, and they were quite brief. He said, "Thank you very much for coming, and Godspeed on the way home." Let me say a couple of things that might be relevant to all this. In the first place, I agree with Jacques completely that the aquarium has been a wonderful asset for this community, and hosting events like this is a terrific thing for the aquarium to do. It's largely due to Bob Davidson and his board who supports him. This picture of what the coast looks like in the marine environment is certainly relevant to what we're doing here, what we're talking about here this morning. And Bob certainly deserves a lot of credit for this. As well, the fact that this is happening with the U.S. and Canada cooperating on this kind of research is really important. We've talked about the Salish Sea and not just the Puget Sound as being the real marine environment that we're dealing with, and it is. And for us to do research and then the Canadians to do research without coordinating all that doesn't make a lot of sense. And I think that we should recognize the two countries working together on this kind of project are a lot more likely to come up with a uniform set of findings and recommendations that will have a greater impact in both countries than they would if we try to do this singly. Let me just mention something, not to tell you what I've been doing the last 15 years. I know we don't have a lot of time for that, but just to give you some context in which Jacques has asked me to come up here and talk to you. I first got exposed to all of this stuff in the late 90s when then President Clinton asked me to help in the negotiation of the Pacific Salmon Treaty with the Canadians. There was a Canadian counterpart who was also appointed, and we spent several months looking at the problems associated with negotiating the treaty with the two countries. The issue was finally resolved between Ottawa and the White House, really, is how far it had to escalate in order to get solved. And it has, I think, had a calming influence on the kind of contention that existed between the two countries over these treaties. The treaties have periodic periods in which they have to be renegotiated, and that inevitably causes tension between the two countries. But this certainly opened my eyes as to how complex this problem was. After that, I was asked by the governor to become the chairman of the Salmon Recovery Funding Board here in this state, which Jeanette Dorner has indicated to you is the role that she plays and the Pacific and the Puget Sound Partnership plays in the allocation of monies for the recovery of salmon. The Surf Board actually makes the choices as to where the habitat projects should be funded. It's a sort of unique agency of the state government that allocates money for salmon habitat recovery. I've been on several monitoring panels. Monitoring is a big issue in this area. It's very hard to figure out exactly how to do it. We spend a lot of money monitoring all kinds of aspects of salmon recovery in the oceans. They're not well coordinated and really need to be. We had an effort here in Puget Sound to develop a plan for the recovery of the salmon that was done from a both top-down and bottoms-up effort that resulted in a plan that NOAA approved, and is the plan that is currently being used and embraced by the watershed groups to help recover salmon in Puget Sound. It was a kind of unique effort where the two governments, the state and federal government, as well as the tribal government, delegated responsibility to people living in the watersheds to help recover salmon. And finally, just last year, we completed a study on ocean acidification that I was involved in as a co-chairman, that was done by at the governor's request here in the state of Washington. One of the things we found was, the scientists told us from the University of Washington, is because of the increased acidification of the ocean, as many as 30% of the species living in Puget Sound are threatened. And it goes beyond a threat with oysters already in terms of their ability to form shells, not all of them, but about half of them. So this is an ongoing problem. It's not going to get better. It's only going to get worse as years go by and as more carbon is absorbed by the ocean, which increases the acidification. I say all this stuff not to gain any sympathy from you and not to accept that I'm the sole cause of the decline of the salmon here in Puget Sound or the Salish. Very close. But really to underscore that throughout all of this stuff, starting with this treaty, I have heard over and over and over again, whenever we get stumped on what is happening with the fish, why aren't the fish doing better? Why haven't they been increased after spending literally hundreds of millions of dollars on habitat recovery? Somebody will say it's ocean conditions. The ocean conditions are not suitable for these fish. I got so interested in hearing this over and over again. I went to a conference up in Victoria in British Columbia on the question of ocean conditions. What should we do about it? And sitting there for 2 days and becoming thoroughly confused, a scientist got up at the end of the conference and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been witness here in the last 2 days to 48 hours of religion." He said, "There's almost no science associated with what anybody is claiming. Everybody had a different idea as to what ocean conditions meant and what the contribution was being made." Well, I see this project as trying to answer that question. The late Stephen Jay Gould, that's the Harvard scientist who wrote a book about this subject of moving from the magisterium of faith to the magisterium of science. And that's what we're trying to do here, take this out of the belief magisterium and move it into a fact-based magisterium. And if we're successful at doing that, it should be a much better way of guiding science and guiding public policy to embrace the facts generated as a result of the research done here so that we'll make wiser choices. It was pretty much the same point that Will Stell has made. And it's terribly important that we base these decisions on sound science, and that we therefore have a much better chance of having success when we make these public expenditures. So let me commend both Long Live the Kings, the Pacific Salmon Foundation in both countries, for having participated in this result. And stay tuned, because it's a 7-year effort. We're in the 2nd year of it. And it should have a big impact on informing our discretion when we make policy choices in the future. So thank you very much for coming, and drive safely on the way home.
Thank you, Bill. So I would like, please thank all of our panelists for taking time out of their busy morning. I would like to thank just a few people. Carol McGrath from our staff, Natasha Dworkin from Dworkin Communications, and Mende Drok from Kohlauer and Cohen put this together. And I will like to point out that it is 9:29, and hopefully the rest of this program will work as efficiently as this panel and discussion did, and we will be successful. There's one last person I'd like to thank, and that is Michael Schmidt. He identified this as an issue on the U.S. side and has doggedly pursued this. He put together the technical team. He put together and helps me to staff the coordinating committee, and I would like to give Michael a round of applause for his effort. Thank you. Have a nice day.